Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading Mr. Lincoln's Drummer about a boy named Willie Johnston who has signed on with the Union Army to be a drummer. He thought he was going to be with his father, but his father was put in a different company. I was roused a little short of 6 o'clock the next morning by a dark-haired fellow in his early 20s. "You Johnston?" he said, shaking me half to death. "Come along, it's time to beat out reveille." I yawned and plunged my head back into the blanket. "Now," the fellow shouted. He dragged me to my feet, laughed some, and gave my rump a resounding slap. "Well, why did you do that?" I asked, rubbing away the sting. "It's how you get babies breathing, ain't it?" he asked. "I'm Wheeler, the fifer. Get yourself dressed, grab the drum, and come on out. The whole company's bound to be late if we're not on time." I shook myself awake, threw on my shirt, and grabbed my drum. "Willie, you forgot something, didn't you?" Russ asked. "Eh?" I asked, gazing around at my bedding. "Boots would help some, but you'd be a little conspicuous without your pants." I gazed at my bare knees and chuckled. I set the drum back down and pulled on my trousers, slid the suspenders over my bony shoulders, and pulled on my boots. Then I grabbed the drum and hurried outside. "You know the call?" Wheeler asked as he led me along toward the end of the line of tents. "Learned it once, but I don't recall it any too well." "Then listen good. A fife won't wake anybody. Your drum will have to do the trick." He hummed the tune, and I listened attentively. Then he motioned for me to begin, and I tapped out the reveille command. All around me, other drummers were doing the same, and the sounds of drums echoed down toward the river and filled the air with a martial rhythm. "Now what?" I asked as the men stumbled out of their tents. Some managed to dress themselves, but as many as half remained in their shirts. Some of the soldiers emerged wrapped in blankets. "You did that just fine," a tallish man in his early 30s announced as he stopped beside me. He buttoned up his tunic, and I recognized immediately the shoulder boards of an officer. "This is our lieutenant, Erastus Buck," Wheeler explained. "I'm Willie," I told the lieutenant, offering my hand. "Willie Johnston." "Welcome to Camp Griffin, Johnston," Lieutenant Buck replied. He did not shake my hand. Instead, he drew out a small book from his pocket. "Give them another beat, drummer," he instructed, "and tomorrow make certain you're here on time. Captain Harrington doesn't like to hear another drum before our own beats reveille." "Yes, sir," I replied, stiffening my back. Lieutenant Buck stood us opposite the men on what he explained was the color line, where the flags were displayed. That morning, no one brought out a flag. It was cold, damp, and misty. I immediately regretted not wearing my tunic because the wind bit right through my shoulders. The lieutenant called out names from his little book, and each man announced his presence. 2 or 3 didn't respond, and one of the corporals explained they were on the sick list. "The third's had its fair share of sick," Wheeler whispered. Once he completed the roll call, Lieutenant Buck dismissed the men and set about making his morning report. "Want my help, Lieutenant?" Wheeler asked. "You show our drummer around," Buck replied. "Get it done fast, though. We'll want breakfast call made on time." "Come on," Wheeler urged, dragging me behind him. He then devoted half an hour to explaining the camp layout. The officers occupied larger square-walled tents with peaked tops at the end of a long line of conical soldier tents. Wheeler also showed me the regimental headquarters, the guard stations, and, most important, the sinks. "Everyone finds his way down here," the fifer said, laughing as a tallish fellow in bare feet hurried past us. The regiment had constructed rough latrines in a long line on the fringe of our camp. Another area was devoted to wash basins, and several men shaved off whiskers or washed themselves there. A third area was reserved for dumping garbage. The place had a terrible, foul smell. "There's not much privacy," I observed, noting that the men pretty much crowded together as they relieved themselves. "I suppose you'd prefer an officer's privy," Wheeler said, laughing as he stepped up to the rail and dropped his pants. Actually, I would have, and I found out pretty quickly that the only thing in the Army lower than a private was a drummer. We did not, in fact, rate at all. I wasn't even listed on the muster book, and I generally found myself at the end of every line. Come on, Wheeler said, making a place for me at the rail. You can't wait for someone to give you an engraved invitation. Get up here and tend to business. You have to hurry and beat the breakfast call. I reluctantly tended to nature's call. I sensed 100 eyes on me, though, and it felt peculiar. Sleep all right, son? Pa asked, making room for himself at my side. Here, you might want this. He handed me a half sheet from a newspaper, and I grinned my thanks. It's a little hard to get used to, I told him. I think they're going to use the newspaper as toilet paper. I spoke to Colonel Hyde about moving over to Company D, but he won't allow it, Pa explained. So I guess we won't see too much of each other. I guess not, I said, frowning. Don't worry about me, though. Cal Stebbins and the Stevens boys are sharing their tent with me. You'll do fine, Willie. Probably grow as tall as I am by midsummer. Not on Army food, I grumbled. He laughed then, and I decided that as long as we could laugh in a latrine, we'd both fare all right. I had to hurry to the color line to make the breakfast call on time. Afterward, I stumbled back to the tent. Get something to eat, Wheeler told me. Then dress yourself properly. Button everything and put on a cap. That might make you a little older. How old are you, anyway? Not more than 14. Not quite 12, I confessed. Children, Wheeler said, sighing. I'm 24, and I thought I was young. Just what the company needs, another PF. Wheeler departed. I stepped inside the tent. Moses was spreading a strange green paste into flat Army biscuits. He handed me one. We call it peas on a trencher, Cal explained. It's polite company. I grinned. It had little taste to it, but the biscuit was hard, and the peas were cold. I barely got it down my gullet, and I had to gulp down 2 cups of boiled coffee to get it to stay there. Saw you got the guided tour, Russ said, digging my cap out of the pile of equipment heaped up beside the door. We stand inspection around 8, but you'll need to look your best when you beat the sick call. Lieutenant Buck likes to send somebody to the surgeon with the sick men. He's been sending Wheeler. Now I imagine he'll dispatch you. Send the most useless fellow in the company, eh? I asked. Well, not exactly, Russ said, grinning. But close, I muttered. By the way, what's a PF? Peach fuzz, Russ said, reddening. They call us that sometimes, Cal said, shaking his head. Not with kind intentions, either. And it's usually some fellow like Jace Wheeler, who only has a few years on us. And nothing close to a beard, Russ added. Anyhow, you just stand tall and proud when they say that, Willie, Cal urged. We sort of call ourselves fuzzies. The whole company's on the young side, after all. Once we get into battle, they'll stop snickering. I kind of took to the name myself. It made us all that much more determined to do each task better. At sick call, my teammates and I stood at attention in full uniform, and even Lieutenant Buck nodded with approval. Johnston, he said once he'd given approval for 3 men to see the surgeon, you take them down to Doc Jones. Make certain you get this receipt signed for them, and if the doc says they're fit, bring them back here directly. Yes, sir, I said, giving him a crisp salute. Fuzz, Wheeler mumbled under his breath. I gave him a scowl and took charge of the sick men. They knew better than I did the fastest way to the hospital tent, and I had trouble keeping up, much less leading the way. 2 were suffering from bowel problems, and the doc waved them toward his orderly. The 3rd man had a festering cut on his leg. You should have seen me earlier, Doc Jones told the man. This could be serious. After directing the man inside the tent, the doctor turned toward me. You look like a regular soldier now, Willie, he said. Like a drummer, anyway, I replied. I'd need promotion to merit a private's respect. Don't let them bother you, son. Do your duty, be respectful, and even the sourest among them will come along. Now, it's too late to snatch you something from the mess, but I believe I have something in my pocket you can make use of. What do you think that is? What could the doctor have in his pocket that Willie would like? Well, we'll find out. He drew out 3 sticks of candy and pressed them into my hands. Thanks, Doc, I said, grinning. I'll always have something of the sort for you youngsters, Doc Jones explained. This should make the misery more digestible and the monotony almost tolerable. Does us all good to see a shine in the eyes of a drummer. Yes, sir, I agreed. Back with the company, I turned over the candy to Moses. You should keep 1 stick just for yourself, he advised. Nope, we share in this tent, isn't that what you told me? Well, Willie, so long as you keep making discoveries like this, we'll be happy to share the work, the cold, and the smell, he told me. I used what time remained to fetch kindling for the stove. Cal and Lando were splitting logs, and although I offered to take a turn at the axe, I don't believe either quite trusted me to keep on my toes and still do any damage to those tough Potomac logs. At 8 o'clock, I beat the 4th call of the day, guard mount. Captain Harrington inspected the company this time, and he generously meted out complaints. He told Cal to stand straight. He criticized Blackie Stevens for a smidgen of rust on his rifle. Your weapon is the most critical piece of equipment you possess, the captain growled. You're useless as a soldier without it. I don't want to see another rifled musket with a trace of tarnish, much less rust. Soldier, you'll stand an extra turn at guard until that rifle shines. Lieutenant Buck noted the punishment. Several others were also assigned extra details. In general, we other fuzzies passed without notice. While a guard detail marched off to take its post, Lieutenant Buck nudged my shoulder. Beat assembly for drill, he ordered. I remembered that call, and the wheeler didn't have to help me begin. These Captain D men, not assigned other duties, lined up and began the long, tiresome drilling that marked daily camp life. Wheeler and I took our places at the head of a column, and we played as Company D marched up and down a nearby field. It was cold and wet, and Wheeler told me Captain Harrington wouldn't keep us out long. He didn't. Dismiss the men, he told Lieutenant Buck. They can police the camp until dinner. Thank you, sir, Buck replied. He then motioned for me to beat my drum, waved for me to stop, and ordered the company dismissed. We fuzzies resumed our various camp duties. For me, that meant collecting more kindling. Later, I mended tears in my tent mates' clothes. They, in turn, showed me how to stow my equipment. I left only long enough to beat out roast beef at the dinner meal was called. As the dinner meal call was known. Moses prepared a stew, and for the first time since leaving St. J, I was actually full. He topped the meal by passing out pieces of my stick candy. He took great pains to explain to everyone that I had provided the treat. The remainder of that day, like all others, consisted of drumming the different calls, tending to the miscellaneous duties of company musician. The calls included dress parade, a regimental assembly late each afternoon when the colonel addressed us personally. Cal explained that we usually drilled afterward, but the various companies had churned the field into a bog, and the colonel declined to send us out in the mud again. Supper call announced the day's 3rd meal. After night fell, I beat tattoo, a final roll call, and taps, signaling all soldiers not posted to guard detail to return to their tents, douse their lights, and cease all noise. Most of us rolled out our blankets, stripped down to our underclothes, and tried to find a good night's sleep. Fortunately, only Lando among my teammates snored. Unfortunately, He had a habit of falling right to sleep, and anyone who didn't was treated to his bear-like grunts and growls. We passed all of December, January, and February at Camp Griffin, alternating freezing and drilling. Sometimes we did both. In January, Will Currier, a 28-year-old farmer from Brighton, was promoted to sergeant. He assumed many of Lieutenant Buck's daily tasks. With half of my teammates from his hometown, you might have suspected the Fuzzies would get better treatment. "Curry's hoping to become an officer," Lando declared. "I don't expect him to let much pass." Those winter months went by slowly for me. I tend to stay busy, but it wasn't always possible. At the slow times, especially when a blizzard tormented us in late January, I grew homesick. Sometimes I smuggled myself over to Company B and spent the night with Pa. "Maybe I should speak with the colonel again," Pa suggested. "A lot of boys are winning discharges and going back home." "I didn't come out here to run home," I argued. "The company needs me. Captain Harrington says a drummer's the heart of his company. He taps out the pulse so the men know what to do." On good days, when the regiment drilled together, I had a chance to pass some time with Julian Scott, the Pfeiffer artist. He was still sketching everything in sight, and he offered me a portrait to send Ma for Christmas. That drawing showed me beating the drum at guard mount, and I think it made me appear older. Julian also sketched us at other less favorable moments. He showed us pranking the officers, playing cards, or washing ourselves at the sinks. The last drawing helped kindle a stove. In other words, they threw it in the stove. They didn't even see it, or they looked at it and threw it away. When the officers tolerated a good deal of foolishness from all the men, and from musicians in particular, they expected us to beat each call on time and to keep our guard posts no matter what. I was stationed with Russ and Blackie Stevens the final week of February. Julian and a Groton boy, Will Scott, also manned the spot. A rider approached around midnight, and I nudged Russ. Will Scott, meanwhile, shouldered his rifle and hollered a challenge. "Whoa, son!" the rider cried. "Brigade messenger!" "Password?" Julian demanded. "I don't have your fool regiment's password," the rider barked. "Let me pass. I've got dispatches for Colonel Hyde." "Dismount," Russ suggested. "We better have a good look at you." The rider howled a curse or two and complained that some Vermonters didn't have the sense to know black from white. He gave Julian his horse reins, dismounted, and showed us an order signed by General Brooks, the brigade commander. "Pass," Blackie announced, waving Julian and Will away. "It's fine to be careful, but you can take it too far." "Well, say what you want," Will declared. "I've had my share of adventure on guard duty, and I wouldn't wish 'em on anybody else." "Now that's sure true," Julian said, laughing. The others thought a moment and broke into grins, all except Will, who remained deadly serious. "You don't understand, Willie," Julian said, shaking his head. "Tell him, Will." "It's a long story," Will began, "but I wager that once you hear it, you won't take guard duty any too lightly." "We were stationed at the end of a chain bridge last autumn," Will explained. "One of my tent mates had guard duty, but he was fighting some stomach misery, and feeling sorry for the youngster, I took his place. It was a long, dark night, and I hadn't had much rest. A little past midnight, I fell asleep. When the relief arrived, I was sleeping. They took me to the provost, placed me under arrest, and the next thing I knew, I was tried, convicted, and sentenced to be shot. I always thought there was some danger coming from the Rebs, but I never expected my own regiment to deliver me up like that," Will said, shuddering as he recalled it. "They were all set to do it, too." "We went around writing letters," Julian explained. "You were just worried they might get their Scots confused," Will argued. "Anyway, we sent petitions from the whole regiment and a considerable part of the army to Mr. Lincoln himself," Julian added. "The next thing you know, the president rides down and has a talk with the generals. I will not allow the lad to be shot, Mr. Lincoln told them. I got pardoned and returned to duty, Will said, sighing. But if Mr. Lincoln's carriage had broken down or he had trouble finding the brigade, I would sure be dead. And that's why some of us take guard duty seriously, Julia noted. And you boys will too if you're smart. I couldn't speak for the others. I knew I would. Getting killed in a war's one thing. Being shot for neglecting your duties was another. Whew. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I could. I mean, I was a Girl Scout and I camped a lot, but wow, they really are roughing it. Hope you're enjoying this story. And remember, this is based on a real story, a real boy named Willie Johnston. See you later. Bye-bye.